first thing I did was what they called an extension program that I did with the Instituto Naturaleza y Sociedad de Oaxaca. And they're an amazing organization that does all kinds of environmental work with a real commitment to the kind of social fabric of the culture there. I arranged to go to the site that they're developing as a kind of demonstration site for agricultural practices that sustain the environment, and they're really concerned about the watershed in Oaxaca. The population is growing radically and a lot of problems are happening in terms of the watershed. So they've taken this, it's called Fin de Graal, which means the rocky place, and it's very steep and very rocky. And over 5 years they've been terracing and using vetiver grass to hold in the water and plant the traditional milpas with corn and squash and beans, and they built in a little adobe casita and a traditional oven cooking space and compost toilets, and they have a nursery and all different kinds of composting systems and a greenhouse. And in the 5 years that they've been working there, the water table has risen 150 centimeters. And they build the gabions and the creek beds to keep the water there so it filters down into the water table. And then they take the silt, instead of having it rush down into the valley, the silt gets replaced back into the farm. So I was there learning all about this place and getting really excited about it. And also I taught a workshop, and there'd been the publicity had gone out quite late. So, but there were maybe 10 students, mostly university students. There was a biologist, an anthropologist, some visual artists, a couple of musicians. So I think someone in communications, and they came up to this site and we worked together, figuring out just on a human scale by moving through the landscape how it was shaped by water, and then kind of talking about those processes and taking it into some movement and some body work, working with the bony structure and kind of making analogous relationships between the kind of structure of the bones and of the mountains and the fluids of the body and the fluids of the landscape.
And did you present something to
So
an
then
audience?
at the end of the week of Prisma, we brought people up to the site, and because people weren't really dancers and didn't feel comfortable performing, we brought people into our process in some ways. So we walked up the hill and did some kind of listening and sensory exercises, and climbing up the hill made everyone's heart beat strongly, so we felt each other's hearts and each other's breath, a lot of kind of simple exercises to kind of get a sense of the place and our body's relationship to the place. And then we walked up under this beautiful tree. It was very green, and one of the participants talked about her relationship to land as an indigenous person, and she spoke in Mixteca.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really beautiful. And then they walked up the hill and they did something with rocks, because the rocks there are very porous and break up easily. And then I was down, they watched me dance, and then they walked through these kind of trenches that are built to collect the water. And then Nick was kind of dancing, and he'd learned, oh my god, I'm forgetting the name of the dance, Baile de Pluma.
Uh-huh.
And so he learned it from one of the this architect who was a student architect, but also a folk dancer, and they were both going to do it, but then the architect couldn't be there, and so Nick did his sort of version of it, and it was gorgeous, beautiful. He did such a beautiful dance, but it was kind of at the edge of the earth, so you saw him kind of suspended in the sky. It was really beautiful. My most significant experience was meeting these people from the institute. Their openness to the kind of work that I was doing. It was not only their openness, but the way I learned about the integration of culture with environmental work in a way that's happening. It happens in that culture more easily than here, I think. Even with the students, I was thinking about, I just taught at Earth Dance, and everyone's very quiet and serious as they go into nature. And the Mexicans were just like yakety yakety, they're just more at home in some way, or like the acculturation of what's inside and outside is more mixed, it seemed to me. Prisma itself was this incredibly intense and dense week of activity that brought a bunch of people together that I sort of heard about but wasn't that familiar with. And the thing that most impressed me was the building that it happened in was such a beautiful building, and I feel like the building itself supported this really open exchange, even though there was a lot of tension and confusion and problematic points of view that sometimes were in conflict. I felt the container allowed people to really begin to scratch at some of these really complicated and problematic issues in art globally, or where power is, what kind of hierarchies are being broken down or being reified. That seemed very contemporary. The number of people and the way they're building networks that's really based on internet communication, I think, seemed very new and very exciting. And the kind of seminars that were happening in the afternoons that were less formal seemed very rich and sharing a lot of information.
Right.
And sort of self-organizing. In some ways it seemed like it was very much holding on to this model in terms of who was being presented. But I think that probably has a lot to do with how they were funded. So I think in retrospect about who was being presented and in which theaters. It was mostly the European men. Ta-da, surprise, surprise. This distinction between what Europe is doing and what the US is doing, and I haven't spent a lot of time in Europe, and I see what happens here, and it seems like there's a kind of friction around the body and the body as a source of knowledge, and that this kind of intellectualizing and theorizing that can be maybe alienating in some contexts, or not encompassing or inclusive. I think there was a real attempt to include participation and the body into the discussion. But it's interesting to me, it seems like most of, I don't know if this is generalization, but the people who are presenting work are people who don't have a really long history in dancing and in their bodies. So they're kind of referring to something they're coming at from a very kind of it's aesthetically mature, articulated place that's not really of the body. I don't know, like Martin Spangberg or Sadia Leroy. So there's this experiential systems of knowledge that I think the U.S. artists really work on, and that seem like it's even maybe more intensively in Latin America. That there's a kind of much more, I don't know that. I didn't see, there was very little actually Latin American work shown. A lot of the Latin Americans were more theater-based and more community-based, and really vibrant and vital in communities, and bringing that into the conversation, where I feel like the Europeans don't have that history as much. And those kind of deal with larger kind of class and cultural power issues.
But you say that they were talking to each other very openly somehow.
I felt like there was room. There was a desire for that dialogue. And I think it was really important that was happening in Mexico. And we camped up there for the first couple of days when we were doing the workshop, and Monson Pedro's brothers came with us, and they took care of us. And a few rainy seasons, we had rain every night, and then these white flowers would bloom in the rain at nighttime, and the fireflies would come out. It was a really spectacular place.